My name is Tamara Daly. In this presentation, I will be comparing gamification and scenario-based learning in terms of theoretical foundations, key concepts and principles, and the potential impact on learners. I will conclude with an example that combines the two techniques. Both scenario-based learning and gamification, as it's used in learning, are active ways of engaging learners. Active learning is usually talked about in terms of giving students activities that allow them to actively construct knowledge and their own understanding. This type of learning requires higher order thinking and metacognition, which is also a critical element because it involves this active exploration of your own thinking processes. So as students are engaging in scenarios, or if they are playing, or not playing, but engaged in activities that involve game mechanics, they have to really explore their own thinking in order to be successful. These kinds of activities where active learning is being engaged allow for content mastery, but also for the development of higher order skills, problem solving, critical thinking, and the application of knowledge to new contexts that are going to be used in the future. So let's start with some basic definitions. Gamification is typically described as applying game-like mechanics to non-game situations or contexts in order to teach people very specific kinds of behaviors or allow them to practice certain kinds of skills. Another way of defining it is more simple. It's just using game elements in non-game situations. And typically this is to using it to promote learning, to develop skills, to master content, and so on. Scenario-based learning is usually defined in terms of the learner being presented with a situation or a scenario, a context, and then they are asked to how they would like to go forward in dealing with this scenario or situation. The theoretical foundations for gamification are many. In one of our articles that we read for this week, Bureau talked about gamification as perhaps being its own kind of learning theory. Krath et al., though, did an extensive review of the literature and found well over 100 references to separate theories that are connected to the use of gamification. And they divided this up into three different areas. Affect and motivation theories that included the most commonly cited theory, which is self-determination theory. And self-determination theory is based on basic human psychological needs for autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And then they also talked about self-efficacy theory, which is a little less often cited, but still very commonly used. And it's based on the idea that learning and operating in whether it's in a game-like situation or not involves the motivational component of the belief that you can actually successfully perform a behavior. So self-efficacy matters. In terms of behavior, the theory that is most often described is basic behavioral theory or reinforcement theory, but there's also the cognitive learning approach called the theory of planned behavior, which takes into consideration, how people view other people's predicted behaviors, how they view their own predicted behavior, are they establishing a goal that they have in mind, etc. And then finally, learning-based theories that focus on how people learn. And that's most often they're citing social learning theory and social cognitive theories in terms of the impact on actual learning. For scenario-based learning, the most commonly cited theoretical basis is situated learning theory. And that involves the assumption that learning has to be situated in a context. Situated learning theory assumes that learning is going to occur most optimally when it's in the context it's going to be used. So, for example, Reese gives the example of if you're training firefighters on, safe protocols for entering a structure, you can create scenarios that are tethered to that actual situation, and that learning is going to be best optimized in that sort of context. Reese also argues this involves situated thinking or situated cognition. So the type of thinking that people are going to be engaging in is really dependent on the context in which the decisions have to be made and the behaviors have to be exhibited. What are the key components of gamification? Gamification is typically described as involving game elements or game mechanics. So you might see things like mastering different levels, getting points, getting badges, the display of leaderboards using avatars, quests, certificates, etc. And there's kind of an assumption here that there's a social element, that people can see other people's levels of performance, their levels of achievement, and so on. In their literature review, Kraft et al. Summarized what they learned from really examining this literature as in terms of 10 basic principles of gamification as they apply to learning. Gamification of the learning technique, whatever it is that you're using, involves clear goals that are relevant to the task, individual goal setting, the provision of immediate feedback, giving people positive reinforcement when they successfully perform skills or achieve goals, the potential for both social comparison and social norming, the ability of the content to adapt itself to the behaviors of the learner, paths that are guided, meaning, there's if you do A, then B will follow. If you do B, then C will follow, and so on. Learners being given multiple choices, and the gamification can actually simplify the user's experience in the context of what they're learning. For scenario-based learning, there are a lot of different ways of describing what scenario-based learning involves. At its simplest, you give the person a context and you ask them, and you explain to them where this context is, what its elements are, who's involved in it, what's being done, and so on. And then the learner is given choices. Which do you want to do? Choice A, choice B, choice C. Or maybe it's a two-choice scenario. Are you going to go with path A? You're going to go with path B. And then it plays itself out in terms of outcomes. One of the major characteristics is there's an authentic narrative that's situated in a learning context that's relevant to the learner. So you use these narratives to frame very specific kinds of problems that are relevant to what the student is learning. So, just thinking off the top of my head, if I have students who are studying engineering, and it's in a civil engineering situation, and they need to figure out, what kind of intersection is needed here to minimize accidents and maximize flow of traffic. That's an authentic situation. The narrative will include, a great deal of information on variables that are present in that situation, and then the students will have to make choices as to what they want to use. Maybe choice A is a roundabout and choice B is a traditional traffic light. Maybe choice C is a four-way stop, and so on. These situations are interactive and allow for simulated reflections of that scenario. The learners can analyze the situation, use those critical thinking and problem-solving skills to make choices. The situation, as it's being played out, since it's a simulation, is low risk. The stakes are relatively low. You're not actually, as a civil engineering student, going to go out and build a roundabout and see what happens. Instead, you're going to use that simulated environment. Scenario-based learning typically involves a branching structure, and that can allow students to revisit the scenario and choose different options to see what the outcomes are. Reese describes this as involving a loop where you understand the scenario, you apply critical thinking skills, problem-solving skills, and then you reflect on the feedback that you're given in this loop. Every time you return to the scenario, you're going to revisit the loop again. For gamification, the impacts of learning, according to Kraft et al., are in the areas of motivation and engagement. Since gamification involves an emphasis on progress and goal setting, people can become very engaged and highly motivated to continue the activity. It also promotes behavior change because you get a lot of immediate feedback, and also you can engage in social comparison and norming and then adjust your behavior so that your performance improves. And then there's improved learning. Since the gamification tools tend to create adaptive content, it is constantly able to challenge the learner to acquire new content, or to master new content, to acquire new skills. Same goes for having multiple paths and choices to make. That increased engagement and motivation can actually encourage people to revisit the content more and more often, and that improves learning. The simplified user experience it's usually in terms of the fact that people are familiar with these game mechanics from a wide range of situations. If those game mechanics are then put into the learning context, that simple user experience, since we've all experienced gamification in many aspects of our lives, it feels familiar, it feels fun, it feels engaging. So again, people will revisit that learning context over and over based on that similarity, and that can improve learning. For SBL, the situation of the learning scenario into an authentic context increases engagement and motivation on the part of the learner. Since it feels like it's highly connected to the student's own range of interests, especially if you're talking about, if I go back to that in engineering example of the civil engineer trying to figure out what kinds of intersections are going to be the most safe, but also maintain the flow of traffic. It's a real life, meaningful situation for that learner. Or if I go to a psychology student who's learning about providing treatments to a child with autism, they may engage in a scenario-based learning situation where you get a profile of a particular person with autism, and you're represented with multiple choices of pathways you could take to managing the learning situation for that client. And based on which one you choose, you may get different outcomes. And being engaged in that authentic context can really heighten the degree to which the student is engaged and motivated to learn. So doing this can enhance knowledge and understanding of the content, but also build skills. Immediate feedback, just like with gamification, enhances learning greatly. And one of the key benefits of SBL is that it does require those higher order decision-making, thinking, problem-solving aspects, as well as a high degree of metacognition. You really have to think about, why did I choose this option as opposed to this option? What happened with my micro decisions along the pathway to solving, to whichever choice that I made, and so on. Finally, SBL provides us with, a safe space for learning. It's describing a real-world situation without actually being in that situation, and that allows for learners to revisit the learning context and take different pathways as they are learning, and that teaches them a lot about the pros and cons of those different learning contexts. I'll conclude with an example. I was curious to know whether there were scenario-based learning approaches that included gamification elements. I found one example out there. I'm sure there are many, many more. Brown argued that you can use, and this is actually a corporate example, the company that Brown is writing about actually offers these kinds of training modules. So what Brown describes is an example of combining scenario-based learning with gamification elements. Brown argues that, gamification in e-learning uses stories, visual design elements, provides competitions, challenges, rewards, and feedback in order to enhance learning. So the specific example that he describes is using simple game mechanics within an SBL approach. It involves a realistic learning environment, and in this case, the product was created for training salespeople in achieving higher productivity and greater success in their sales approaches. So the realistic learning environment, which is the scenario-based component, is a sales simulation that has a lot of meaning for salespeople in their real jobs. It involves an interactive scenario, a simulation that matches their real-world sales situations. The goal is to enhance their sales skills and their decision-making in a low-stakes environment, since it is a simulation. So it involves safe practice, where they can train people in effective sales techniques and improve their performance. Now, Brown argues that it works because it creates a sense of competition and urgency, and that's created by the game mechanics, but it's in this real-life situation and involves real-life scenarios that are reflective of how fast-paced and engaged in a real-life sales situation is. It also works because the user isn't controlling an abstract character. They're actually the character. So the stakes feel real, and they feel a bit higher, even though the situation is not going to, involve them interacting with a real client in a real workplace, but it allows them to practice. Third, it works because it is a low-cost, in this particular example, a low-cost audio-driven simulation that allows for, in this gamified context, it allows for a lot of training to happen without a high degree of expense for the person. So the graphic that I've included here is just the landing page, but if you wanted to go and try out this simulation, it's made available, and you can find the link in the references. So that concludes my presentation.